little girls were all murdered by a brutal paedophile. He was spotted by a retired grocer as he seized a fourth victim, the daughter of the local policeman.
I was aware of a child walking towards the van, and then next thing the child's feet is beside his feet. And he stooped slightly and the girl's feet disappeared. And I thought, he's lifted her into the van, but he was pushing onto the floor under the dash at the passenger side. And I thought, he shoved that child on the floor. That can't be right.
Taken from outside her home, the village police station, while her policeman father was in a patrol car 10 miles away.
When the treble 9 call for Stow came in, I was in a police vehicle about 10 miles south of Stow. Immediately hearing that, your heart misses at least one beat, probably 2 or 3, and you just go into autopilot.
After 8 years, the hunt for Britain's most elusive paedophile killer was finally over. 6 police forces, millions of pounds, millions of man-hours, but only caught because of the vigilance of a man in his garden. The killer had struck first in July 1982 in Coldstream on the Scottish border. Susan Maxwell, 11 years old, vanished after a game of tennis. It was the first time her mother let her walk home alone. She lived with her family in the next village. For days, hundreds searched the borders. They found nothing. The only leads were the many vehicles sighted round Coldstream that hot holiday afternoon. They included a Mini, a white van, and a Mini Traveller. The best bet seemed the Mini, but it led nowhere.
Every morning I feel this is going to be the day. We're going to get that phone call today to say she's going to be all right and come and get her.
2 weeks after Susan vanished, her mother appealed on the BBC. She was unaware that her child's body had just been found, nearly 300 miles away in Staffordshire. Detective Inspector Peter Herwood was the first senior officer to arrive.
When you go to a scene such as that one and you walk into the cops and you find the body of this young child, I suppose the first thing that hits you is the horror and indeed the sadness of that sight.
They found Susan still in her yellow sports gear. Her knickers had been removed and were folded under her head. The body, which had lain there for 2 weeks, yielded no clues as to how she'd died.
The impact there was such that, right, I'm a policeman, but I'm also a father. I'm the father of a young daughter. And to realise that young Susan had been snatched off the road as she walked home, and taking that vast distance, and who knows what she was subjected to.
Susie's dead. I mean, there's absolutely nothing you can do about that, and until the police finally catch whoever did it, then there's absolutely no point trying to torture yourself even further with imagining what kind of person he is. Once they eventually catch him, then you'll be able to think, well, that's a bastard that did it.
But then a breakthrough. A witness who'd seen a girl with a tennis racket struggling with the occupants of a Triumph 2000. Over subsequent months, police painstakingly traced 19,000 Triumphs and over 1,000 serious sex offenders, but every one turned out to be in the clear. Hanging over the police was the fear of another Yorkshire Ripper fiasco, when vital clues were missed. A government report told police, use computers next time, but there wasn't the money or the right computer available. So again, every name, statement and suspect vehicle had to be laboriously card-indexed.
In 1982, of course, the Holmes computer which is used nowadays had not been developed. Another police service or that we're currently working on trying to develop one, but in 1982 there wasn't a computer.
12 months after Susan vanished, the inquest was held in Uttoxeter. The hunt had ground almost to a halt. The coroner recorded an open verdict. That same evening, in a seaside funfair near Edinburgh, Susan's murderer was stalking another little girl. Portobello is a busy resort, a magnet for crowds on a summer's evening. Caroline Hogg was 5 years old. She'd been to a party and pleaded with her parents to let her stay out just 5 more minutes. Lothian and Borders police realized immediately this was not just another lost child.
There was no immediate evidence to suggest right away that she'd been seen arguing and struggling with anyone, or in fact anybody walking with her at that time. There was absolutely no trace. What was the most sinister aspect was it that she just seemed to disappear.
Forward. We want her back. We want her back now.
After John Hogg's appeal, thousands joined the search for Caroline. This time, unlike the Susan Maxwell case, sightings of the little girl and her abductor flooded in. She'd been seen in the playground at the bottom of her street, and on the roundabout at Fun City, a scruffy man had paid for her ride. They were seen walking off hand in hand. Caroline's school was opposite her home near the beach. Children there had seen a video warning against talking to strangers. Caroline's parents had told her of the dangers on the promenade.
The family in particular, Mr. and Mrs. Hogg, were adamant that their daughter would never go walking hand in hand with anyone. As we looked at it, I found great difficulty in an abduction case of someone openly parading around the promenade area with a child that they intended to kidnap. We couldn't come to terms with that very easily, the more experienced detectives.
One witness was Laura Macpherson, a cashier in an amusement arcade called Treasure Island. She knew Caroline and saw her the night she disappeared.
This is where my friend and I were sitting on the summer's night that we seen Caroline playing on the sand just over there by the railings. Later on she had been in the swing park just over there, and she came out and she was talking to a man, and they were both laughing. And later on she'd walked from there towards the Fun City and disappeared into the crowd.
2 weeks later, Laura saw the same man again on the promenade and followed him.
They walked towards the Fun City as it was known at the time, and I lost him in the crowd and I phoned the police.
Portobello police station is 5 minutes away, but it was 45 minutes before officers arrived. The man had gone, and perhaps a real chance to catch the killer. At police headquarters in Leith, detectives had appealed for holiday snaps, hoping for a glimpse of Caroline. What amazed even seasoned detectives was the number of convicted paedophiles pictured on the Portobello prom that day. 34 of them.
The police were ignorant in the early 80s because there wasn't training. No one was actually passing information to them about the sex offender. And in a sense, the sex offenders are the experts, but if nobody speaks to them, if nobody actually works with them and finds out how they do what they do. I was having clients who had been sexually offending for 30 years without getting caught. How did they do that? How did they shift responsibility onto the children? How did they control the environment they worked in? How did they get away with it? The mark of a sex offender when the police interview them is usually one of denial. I didn't do anything.
An artist's impression of a suspect was withheld for 2 weeks, for fear it could be inaccurate. 10 days after she vanished, Caroline's body was found in a lay-by nearly 300 miles away in Leicestershire.
This situation put a cold chill down some of the younger officers' backs when they were saying to themselves, this could be very, very sinister. And then your mind flashes to, is there any other cases which are outstanding? We certainly thought, within a very short space of time, that it could be connected with Susan Maxwell.
2 little girls abducted, murdered, and dumped in laybys. Police knew they were after a serial killer. The 4 police forces now involved appointed an assistant chief constable to take charge, based in Edinburgh. Hector Clark had 70 successful murder cases behind him. He was promised the latest technology.
I knew that I didn't want to fail. There was never any question of a shortage of manpower or vehicles or equipment or office accommodation. And I knew that if we approached the thing in the right manner, being totally efficient and effective in everything that we did, that we would have a very good chance of clearing it up. It was like going to war, but it was a battle that we could not afford to lose.
Hundreds of new leads were now being pursued, known sex offenders and suspect vehicles. Among them was a Ford Cortina, with a frightened-looking child answering Caroline's description, and a white transit van.
That white van was added to the list latterly, and there was no indications at that time that the perpetrator was driving a white van. Same with the Ford Cortina. You had a massive inquiry there where we covered something beyond 27,000 vehicles. And in the light of that exercise, which was massive and took totally months, when we got to the far end of it, we realized we were never going to get that inquiry completed. So if we'd got to the 47,000, we still wouldn't get every single vehicle accounted for. Therefore, if you're not going to trace all the vehicles, you've got to suggest, well, why would you start in the first place?
Data poured in. Both cases generated vast quantities of information. Hector Clark was desperate to computerize it all.
But what we did do was to use a computer that Lothian Borders Police had here in Edinburgh to record the investigation of the offences in connection with the disappearance of Caroline Hogg. I asked the Chief Constables, particularly Sir William Sutherland, to put the Susan Maxwell case onto the same system. But because he was using a computer that was bought for another purpose, and he wasn't terribly sure that it had the capacity to deal with something else, because he never knew how big it was going to get anyway, he decided that all we could do was to put the Caroline Hogg case on it. And we worked on that basis. Computer system for one offence, a manual system for the other.
Police decided they couldn't investigate every sex offender. Strict criteria had to be established.
The age parameters were covered from 25 to 45, and we were on the subject of dealing with everyone who was involved in indecencies of a serious nature, abduction, etc. Now, that program, believe it or not, is absolutely massive. I'm sorry to say it, but that's what we've got in our country. A huge pile of records in relation to people of that type, and it takes months upon months and years to go through all those lists.
Only serious sex offenders and murderers were checked. Lesser sex criminals were left out. 12 months later, most leads were exhausted. 2 of the incident rooms were closed. Most of the detectives had been dispersed, and the hunters were down to a handful.
It was certainly looking as though we were going to be unlikely to succeed in the investigation. And I was quite prepared to admit that, and I think I did admit it to the press on odd occasions.
On the 26th of March 1986, nearly 200 miles away in Yorkshire, the killer was about to strike again. 10-year-old Sarah Harper went to the corner shop for bread and vanished. Sarah was the eldest of 3 children and lived in this house. She played the cornet for the Salvation Army. She often trotted to the shop 150 yards away, using the back alleys and snickets as shortcuts. Once more, news of a missing child brings out hundreds of volunteers to search.
Wearing a light blue anorak. Yeah. Burgundy jumper. Yeah. Pale pink corduroy skirt.
Sarah left here and walked up this cul-de-sac, and she invariably took the second snicket, passing the first one, took the second snicket, walked through there to the shop, and purchased a loaf. Then she was last seen about here, walking back with the loaf.
Again, unexplained vehicles were the first leads. Again, a white van was one of them. But again, the better lead seemed another vehicle.
A man called Bailey said he'd been in the shop on the night of Sarah's disappearance, at the time she disappeared, and had seen a man that we gave an artist's impression of in the shop. But he also said that he'd seen the same man driving a green Saab in Morley a week after the event. Now, we knew he couldn't have done this because the vehicle check I'd held covered every junction, and details of every vehicle that passed through the check were logged, and none of them was a Saab. The description of the man seen by Bailey in the shop was produced as an artist's impression. Initially, this was kept for police eyes only, but eventually was circulated widely. You've only a sort of limited amount of manpower, and if you start issuing descriptions of vehicles and various descriptions of possible suspects en masse, then the incident room will be flooded with telephone calls, and it's just an exercise that will end in disaster.
I always live in hopes, but the thought that if she's dead, at least she can't be hurt anymore. But we do live in hopes that she's alive.
Another grief-stricken appeal, another media scrum, the growing certainty of another murder. 3,000 premises were searched, scores of local businesses visited, hundreds of statements taken. Everyone was under suspicion.
Initially, I thought the offender lived locally, but after a week, when the body hadn't been found, at the back of my mind, I formed the opinion that this was likely to be linked with the disappearance and murders of Caroline Hogg and Susie Maxwell in Scotland some years earlier. And because of what I thought, I sent a nationwide telex asking for inquiries to be carried out in the areas, inquiries and searches to be carried out.
25 days later, Sarah's body was found 80 miles away in the River Trent near Nottingham by a man walking his dog. The search was over.
The need to be able to touch and say goodbye is so strong. And it's the biggest part of it that I can't deal with. It's very raw, very tender. It'll never go. And it's not enough for people to turn around and say, you should have remembered Sarah as she was. I do, always will. But I needed to say goodbye and was never given the opportunity. And I'm angry and upset, and it hurts. And it will hurt till the day I die. It's just so painful.
Another dead little girl dumped in the Midlands, all three within 20 miles of Ashby-de-la-Zouch. It was to become known as the Midlands Triangle. The water had preserved Sarah's body, so unlike the other two victims, the pathologist could tell what had happened. The 10-year-old had been the victim of a violent sexual attack.
Sarah's body was found floating in the River Trent near Nottingham.
When her body was discovered in the swollen river,
where Sarah's body was found,
she'd been sexually assaulted.
The search teams are checking every.
The emerging picture frightened every parent. A child killer was on the loose, and there was no doubt about his motive.
Sex. I'm quite satisfied the man wanted to commit a sexual attack on a girl.
Three little girls murdered in 4 years, all snatched unseen from the streets, all dumped miles from home, and not a clue to the killer. But the police couldn't agree that the cases were linked.
My personal view was that the similarities were not quite as strong as they were in the other case, and therefore my view was that it was unlikely to have been committed by the same person. I was wrong. I accept I was wrong, but you make judgments in life which you have to live up to or regret.
The differences were so deep that 3 murders weren't treated as one inquiry, but as 2. When officers from each team appeared on the same Crime Watch programme, there was no hint that Sarah's murder was linked to those of Caroline and Susan.
Now, you've brought in with you clothes very similar to the ones that Sarah was wearing that day. You've not yet found the clothes or the loaf, indeed, that she bought.
That's right. The corduroy skirt and the blue anorak, together with the Clark shoes, are still missing.
One overwhelming factor common to all 3 cases was the distance the girls' bodies had been transported before being dumped in the Midlands Triangle, maybe from the M1 or M6. They believed the killer was a traveller or professional driver.
I think, bearing in mind the street, the back street where Sarah went missing from, I think it's likely that the murderer had been to Morley for some reason. He may be an employee, he may have gone there to see friends, relatives, or to attend some function.
At last, in August 1986, amid mounting press speculation about unsolved child killings, police chiefs agreed that the 3 murders must be treated as linked and the data mountain centralised. An operation called the Child Murder Bureau was set up in Bradford to transfer all the key information from index cards to computer. A Yorkshire police inspector made the first firm links between the cases.
The area that they were left in rang the first alarm bell. Then I started looking in more depth into the enquiries themselves and found more common threads. For example, they were just literally dumped and not concealed in any way. Personal items were missing from each of the children, perhaps taken as a souvenir. And the locations around Derby indicated that they may have come down a particular road down towards Derby.
The police in Morley found nothing, so they concentrated on sex offenders, and unlike the other inquiry, they decided to leave no one out, not even flashers.
We trawled all the indecency people, and there were so many, we were obliged to prioritise them, down as far as A, B, C and D. And because of the volume involved, we were only able to interview the A's and a few of the B's. And even that took over 2 years to complete.
It came to my notice that suspects were being interviewed for the Sarah Harper murder, but not being interviewed also for the Maxwell and Hogg murders. So I had to direct on several occasions that the investigating officers actually interviewed for the other 2 murders too.
In 1988, an FBI profile confirmed what police thought already. Their quarry would be a loner who roamed at will, couldn't relate to women, and wanted little girls. The problem was to catch him.
And there's no point in saying to the press, people that you know and people that you respect, that you're making progress. Yes, we're going to get this man. If you know in your own heart that the chances of doing it are getting more remote as each day passes.
In April 1988, the break police had been praying for took place in Nottingham, an attempt to abduct another young girl. But somehow the police missed the connection. It took place in a quiet back street. A tiny 15-year-old schoolgirl, who looked about 12, was walking home. A scruffy man in a blue transit van parked, opened up the vehicle's bonnet, and waited.
When this bloke grabbed me, he put his hand over my mouth and my nose because he had such big hands that I couldn't breathe, and I could smell the body sweat from his body coming onto my body. I noticed that he had hairy arms. I could see his eyes through the sunglasses that he had on, and his clothes were oily, and he was pushing his body against my body. With me being small,
he probably thought, you know, I was only like 12, but, you know, I was 15 and I did put up a fight. I bit his forearm, I grabbed hold of his testicles, and when I did grab hold of his testicles, he shouts, "Well, you bitch, you bit me."
A friend that she'd just left heard her screaming, shouting, came running off the side street. The chap saw him and he panicked, shoving my daughter into the fence. She was banging on the door, she was bleeding, her face was swollen, her knees was grazed and bruised. She said that she'd been attacked on Norton Street by a man.
With so much evidence to identify the culprit, Nottingham police appealed on TV.
We're certain that it's a dark blue Ford Transit. The new shape, the wedge shape, which is generally known as, it's got the twin wheels at the back, and there are no sign writings on its side, so it becomes one of a small number within the country.
Why are you so sure of that?
Well, we've got a glimpse of the van, of the actual van, on a security camera nearby premises. At the same time, we've got the kids running away after the attack.
Nottinghamshire police sent every neighbouring force and the Child Murder Bureau all the details. Van, abduction, scruffy man, a victim who looked a prepubescent 12. Crucially, none of it clicked with any of them. But one Nottingham policeman who worked on this case had also worked on the Sarah Harper case.
The evidence in relation to the Thornhill attempted abduction was the video which depicted the vehicle, Andrew Beeson, who was a very credible witness who identified the vehicle as a Ford Transit van. There was information that the bonnet of the Ford Transit van had dent marks on it, which was another distinguishing feature. There was a skid or a tyre mark on the road at the scene of the crime. There was a silhouette of the perpetrator, and crucially, there were 2 live witnesses.
Nottingham's information was ignored. The best chance police would have to catch the killer before he struck again was wasted.
I suppose because of my different experience to other officers, in as much as I'd been on the Harper inquiry for 6 months, and then I was on the Thornhill inquiry, I was open to the view that there were certain similarities between the 2 cases. It's very difficult for me to say as a junior officer investigating a crime at the sort of inquiry end of it, if you like. My personal opinion is that on receipt of the information, someone has to make a professional decision about whether to connect the 2 crimes or not, and I guess that somebody did make that decision. My personal view as to whether the right decision was made or not, I think is actually irrelevant.
In 1988, we were notified by Nottinghamshire police of an attempted abduction on a 15-year-old girl in their area. Whilst we were notified of this, we didn't particularly link this with the 3 murder inquiries because of the age of the girl involved. The information was passed over to the Sarah Harper murder inquiries because they had links with Nottingham, because that's where Sarah was found, and they actually dealt with the further inquiries there.
That may well be, but it was never brought to my attention. In the cases we'd investigated, was concerned with prepubescent children. This young girl was only 16. I wouldn't have discounted it, but I wouldn't have been greatly excited by it either.
Another year passed, and the killer gave no more chances to the police.
But the public have a completely different concept of how easy or difficult it may be to ensnare someone who operates throughout the length and breadth of the entire country, completely as a loner, with no social ties whatsoever, has a mobile home, is of a particular personal sexual persuasion, targets a particularly vulnerable group in society, and has no identifiable reference points. Needle in a haystack is its glib. It's an enormous, enormous task.
After 8 years, police had 57,000 statements on their databases and 185,000 names, but they weren't any nearer to the one they wanted. But the killer's luck was about to desert him. On a Saturday in July 1990, a van driver stopped in the Scottish village of Stow, 26 miles from where Susan Maxwell disappeared 8 years earlier. He visited the local cafe, then spent 4 hours stalking a young girl. Choosing his moment, he asked her directions, but her dog appeared and he drove off. He watched as another small girl appeared, disappeared, reappeared. Parking on the pavement, he left a gap just big enough for the 6-year-old to squeeze past. As she did so, he pounced. The driver didn't know a neighbour was watching, nor that his victim was the village policeman's daughter.
While I was travelling up the road, I was well aware of previous cases like Caroline Hogg's and Susan Maxwell's, which had been ongoing for several years. So to that end, I was very apprehensive about what I would find, if anything.
As the girl's policeman father raced towards the village, the killer had parked the van in her lay-by. The little girl had been bound and gagged and was close to death.
On that day, I was coming from Galashiels, stopped directly in front of the house there in the Panda car. David shouted across to me.
I shouted, "There's the van." And Ian was running backwards across the road, waving his hands to stop the driver.
I ran across the road in front of the vehicle, running backwards and sideways at the same time. Trying the doors were locked. I opened the back doors of the van with the keys, climbed in, was calling on my daughter. I saw a movement, and then that was the time when I found where she was. When I first opened the sleeping bag up, the first part of her that I could see was her feet, and she had no shoes or socks on. So I stopped briefly, wondering what else I was going to find when I opened up. That she was inside, bound, with her hands tied behind her back, and she was hooded. She was also gagged with 2 pieces of sticky plaster across her mouth. There was just a drain of emotion, effectively. I mean, the relief to find her alive and still okay was just beyond description.
His name was Robert Black. He was a 43-year-old Scot living in London. He drove transit vans delivering posters up and down the country, and he'd just been caught in the act. Catching him was just the beginning. Now they needed to make him talk. Under Scottish law, police have just 6 hours to interview a suspect before releasing or charging him. Roger Orr conducted the first interview.
Even before the interview had been arranged, the pressure I felt was such that I approached my colleague, who was the then Senior Investigating Officer, Andrew Watt, and said, "Do you really want me to do this? Is there someone else you would prefer to do this with you?" And I think that probably reflected the sort of personal pressure that he felt. I could feel throughout the 6 hours, based on the reaction I was getting or not getting, and the information I already knew, that I had a man here who was isolated. He'd suffered a fair degree of personal isolation, and I think sexual isolation, throughout the best part of his life. There was an emptiness in his eyes. That was clear from the first time I ever set eyes on him. And he would stare through you. And your mind's racing on how to cope with that, how to take tactical advantage from that, if you like. And the challenge was not to interrupt that silence, and not to feel under a pressure to interrupt that silence, to leave the silence to speak for itself and effectively deflect the pressure onto him.
Police seized vehicles Black had driven. The van he used at Stow contained all the tools of an abductor. His London flat was packed with child pornography. It also contained a Nottingham newspaper featuring the Thornhill abduction. It was stained with semen.
I believe that there were people who could have put Robert Black's name into that system. 2 of Black's working colleagues did say to us that they had thought in 1983, when Caroline was abducted, they'd cast the mind back 12 months earlier, and they were aware that he was on the journey to Scotland when Susan Maxwell was abducted, and then when Caroline was abducted, yet again they'd made the comment of, "Robbie's up in Scotland again." So they'd give it some thought, but never mention it to anyone.
Whenever a sex offender is offending, he's not just controlling the victim he's abusing, he's controlling other people. That control of other people takes many forms, whether it's a social worker in residential care controlling his colleagues. His colleagues can be seen as secondary victims, or just like the non-abusing partner, why didn't they know? Why didn't they tell? Why couldn't they see it? Why didn't they take action? But we fail to understand how offenders manipulate and control. How in all of us there is a tendency not to want to look at the nakedness of abuse.
In August 1990, Robert Black pleaded guilty to the abduction of Ian Turnbull's daughter in Stow. He was sentenced to life. It was not his first conviction.
He was in the system. He wasn't in the West Yorkshire system. He was in the Scotland Yard system. He was in the Scottish system, but he was not in West Yorkshire system. He had no record in West Yorkshire. Otherwise, he would have been found.
Robert Black had, I think, 2 previous convictions for indecency with children, little girls, and one of them was quite serious offence. But it was recorded as a lewd and libidinous practice, as I understand it, and it was committed by Black some 15 to 20 years prior to Caroline Hogg's disappearance, and it was committed at Kinloch Leven, which is in the far west of Scotland. Now, I can't recall, and I don't know whether or not that offence was notified here to the incident room at Leith, but I wouldn't be surprised if it had been reported and someone had put their pen through it.
Black fitted the FBI profile perfectly, but the seriousness of his previous offences was not properly reflected in his record.
The first known case is when he actually abducts a little girl of 7 from a park in Scotland and takes her to an air raid shelter and strangles her and sexually abuses her and leaves her thinking that she's dead. He was caught and arrested. He appeared as a juvenile in court. They deferred sentence for a year. He went back to court a year later and they admonished him for that offence, and the psychiatric report at the time said it would be wrong to label him and he'd probably grow out of it. I think there's still a danger even today that we are not assessing adolescents in the way that we should.
He moved to London in 1969 and worked as a swimming pool attendant. His behaviour there towards young girls was reported to the police, but there was no prosecution. In 1986, he became a delivery driver. The job suited him.
From a practical point of view, we learned that he was a driver who had been on the go since 1976, travelling extensively throughout the country. He'd built up an intimate knowledge of the road network. He was fairly obsessive in his habits in relation to his job and his driving. He recorded details of his journeys. He recorded mileages between specific places and specific points.
Commercial drivers use a fuel card like a credit card. The petrol agency card is issued to a specific driver and records each fuel transaction.
The initial inquiries with the company said that they got the records from 1983 onwards, but the ones for 1982 for the Susie Maxwell case had been destroyed.
Earlier records were stored by oil companies in giant filing systems. The key information, where Black had bought fuel and when, was on forms called AG30s. Police scanned 7 million of them. This information had to be corroborated with other motorists either side of Black's transaction to confirm the time of purchase.
Perhaps you can imagine someone knocking on your door in 1990 and saying, excuse me, we know that in 1982 you went to a certain garage and you obtained petrol. Can you tell us what time you got that petrol? Now, when you say you need some look at times, the people whose doors we knocked on, in the main, were able to give us the evidence that we were looking for. A man in Manchester, he was able to say, well, just give me 2 minutes, I'll go up my loft, I'll get my diary for 1982. And he came down with the diary. He was able to say what time he left Manchester at 7 a.m. in the morning, what his ETA was, I believe, for Aberdeen, but more importantly, what his time would be in Carlisle where he got his petrol.
As detectives pieced together Black's movements, they discovered he'd made a regular delivery at a Morley firm the day Sarah vanished. It was just 300 yards from her home.
Once Black had been arrested, we realised that the van, the white van seen outside Sarah's house before her abduction, was indeed Black's van. And from his employers, we learned that Black had been to Morley making a delivery on the night that Sarah disappeared.
Twice police had visited the Morley premises, yet had failed in the basic task of getting a list of firms delivering there.
I was disappointed, extremely disappointed, that no one in Morley, despite all our appeals asking for such information, no one had told us that Black was delivering there. But I'm not criticising them. The public are not trained detectives. When I questioned them, they said we just didn't think that he had any connection. On the other hand, perhaps if some of the police officers engaged with the inquiry had been a little more probing when questioning these people, and they had all been questioned repeatedly, if they'd been more probing and spent a little more time, perhaps Black's identity might have been revealed much earlier.
After Black's arrest, another blunder was uncovered. The failure to link the attempted abduction of Teresa Thornhill to the murders. In fact, the entire Thornhill file had been lost.
With them being a police, you'd expect them to put things in places where they can find them and be organised. And when they come round and told me that they had lost it, you know, I was pretty upset about it. I didn't really want to relive it all again and go through bit by bit, and I didn't really want to do that.
Nottingham police telexed other forces with this information, but again, Black had slipped through the net. So when did Hector Clark become aware of the Nottingham attack on Teresa Thornhill?
There was some stage during the inquiry into Black's movements.
Were the details of the attempted abduction ever communicated to his Edinburgh team?
Well, not as far as I'm aware, and I would have asked that question, believe me.
It's clear by looking at the circumstances that what happened to Teresa Thornhill was similar to what happened to the other girls. However, with the other girls, nobody knew exactly in 1988 how they disappeared from the streets.
The fuel and delivery records show conclusively where Black had gone and when. A horrific realization dawned. Black's little victims had spent many, many hours with him before they died. In the Susan Maxwell case, Black left London on Friday, the 30th of June, 1986, on one of his regular delivery runs to Scotland. By 1 p.m. he was in Northumberland. His white van pulled in near Morpeth to fill up. The A697 took him to Coldstream, where soon after 4 o'clock he abducted Susan. He made a number of drops in Edinburgh and Dundee before making his final delivery around midnight in Glasgow. Then south through Carlisle for the Midlands. He disposed of Susan's body in the lay-by near Uttoxeter. 1 year later, in the Caroline Hogg case, Black delivered at Gateshead, Diesel at Belford, then north to Edinburgh, snatching Caroline at Portobello Beach. He made a drop in Glasgow before following his regular route south through Carlisle, then down the M6 and cutting across country using the A50 and the A444. He eventually dumped Caroline's body at the lay-by at Twycross, Leicestershire. The Sarah Harper case, March the 26th, 1986. Black made deliveries in the Midlands, then in Hull, then York, and finally Leeds. Refuelling at Morley, he then delivered to Miles and Spencer. Sarah was snatched returning from the corner shop. He drove south on the M1, dumping her in the river, possibly at Radcliffe-on-Soar near Nottingham. She was unconscious when she went into the water.
once we established that Black was our man, we realised that the white transit van seen outside Sarah's house, but which had disappeared before she left home, was likely to be Black's van. And similarly, a van seen down at Nottingham by another witness around 9:15, not far from the river where we think Sarah's body entered, was also thought to be Black's van.
This time Black, fearing he'd been seen, attempted to build an alibi, diverting back to Hull where he bought more fuel that night. To break the alibi, Yorkshire detectives recreated his journey with a similar vehicle, buying fuel in Morley, as Black had done, then driving to Nottingham, then Hull, where they refuelled, again as Black had done. They used almost the same amount of fuel as he had. It took 3 years. Then the circumstantial case they'd built was put to the test.
We listened to all the evidence. We listened to the summing up of defence and prosecution, and then we listened to the judge summing up. And it was when the judge summed up, I knew inside, in my heart and in my head, that Robert Black was guilty of my daughter's murder. But I had to listen to it. I had to feel it. It was important to me that I had to feel it. I could not take a third party's word for it.
But when the jury went out, you know, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't